the newsagents.
If you are of the P.T. Barnum school of political thinking, the great political philosopher, that there is no such thing as bad publicity, then hats off, Sir Ed Davey. Today has been a triumph.
That was Ed Davey falling head first into Lake Windermere. A lake which, by his own admission, indeed, the reason he was there, is full of human sewage. It is day 5 of the campaign. It's not entirely easy to see where Ed Davey goes from here. It is, for anyone hoping for a restoration of calm and stability to British politics by the general election campaign, we think you're going to be disappointed. Welcome to the newsagents.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
And I thought you would say he's already sinking in shit, but you didn't. And
No.
I thought that showed admirable self-restraint.
I sort of feel that he's already done it to himself. He doesn't need our cruelty, John, to go along with it. I mean, what next? Firing out of a cannon?
I think firing out of a cannon, Evel Knievel trying to jump 64 London buses on a motorbike.
I worry he's peaks. I mean, I just like the idea of this morning, first thing this morning, and he goes into his team and says, right, what's on the agenda, team? What's so? Well, Ed, it's good. We're going to put you on a paddleboard on Lake Windermere. What could possibly go wrong with that?
I know, but I kind of wonder whether Ed Davey did it in the hope that he would fall off, or maybe actually wanted to fall off. I mean, it didn't look that elegant, but it was sort of like a dad being pushed in the swimming pool by his kid, and you make a big show of it, and off he went.
Yeah, and then he
into Lake Windermere.
He did tweet later, I'm not as wet as Rishi Sunak.
Hey,
there we go.
boom.
I mean, it is true that the Lib Dems in particular, who, all the smaller parties get squeezed in the general election campaign. They have to fight for attention every column inch, every second of radio and TV space. And there is no denying that he will definitely get on the bulletins tonight. He will definitely be on TV. It will definitely be across social media. The thing is, I mean, in a way, people make the comparison to Boris Johnson. Of course, Boris Johnson famously got stuck up on a zip wire in London 2012, and Cameron famously said that for any other politician getting stuck on a zip wire would be a disaster. For Boris, it's an absolute triumph. And I suppose and so in a way, yes, it gets people talking about you. But I suppose the thing is about Johnson is he was already so notorious. Most people actually don't know who Ed Davey is. And if they do know him, it might be through the prism of the post office scandal. And here he is looking a little blimp-like, falling into the sea.
Yeah. It's also that kind of Neil Kinnock on Brighton Beach, where he falls over in the waves and kind of everyone has a laugh at that. I honestly, I just think that for Ed Davey, is there a point where this just becomes silly? And yeah, it will get your face on the TV screens tonight. But are you winning? I mean, are you winning anyone over?
Right, this afternoon, Ed, you're going to be feeding the lions at Dudley Zoo. Is that all right? Is that fine? It's nice to...
Yeah, I might get eaten. That would definitely get me on the bulletins.
I mean, I've actually been surprised by this. We're still, as I say, so early in the campaign. This is the first full week. And yet already there have been so many kind of either visual gaffes or kind of PR problems. I mean, mainly has to be said from Sunak and the Tories. It's almost felt at times as if, Labour have got some plants in certainly the Conservative campaign, potentially even the Lib Dem as well. But obviously, I mean, we talked a bit last week, going to speak at the Titanic Quarter in Belfast. There was some footage of him playing football over the weekend, basically look, I am no one to speak, okay? I think
you could have done the dribbling between the cones more elegantly than Rishi Sunak.
Oh, you're so kind, John.
Yeah,
you're so kind.
I mean, and I know you and Sport.
Lewis Graylish Goodall, they call me.
Grealish, not Graylish.
No, I'm talking about the other Graylish.
This is what I think. I think Goodall was just
the sports agents.
Exactly. I think you've just underlined how little you know about.
We say
sport.
Graylish in Birmingham, John.
Exactly, Graylish.
We say Graylish. Yeah, exactly. Jackie Graylish.
Okay. But I just do think that the Sunak star. You just do think there is a saboteur. I mean, why did he go to the Titanic Quarter? Why did he allow himself to be filmed under the sign which said "exit" on the plane? Why did he have a crane coming out of his head in one of the pictures? And you just think this is basic ABC book of political campaigning, that you don't allow your political masters to be filmed in such a way as they become the object of ridicule.
We should say, this is something that you and I will have both seen a lot on the campaign trail. And the reason I'm amazed by it is just because we will have both seen the extent to which, and not just on the campaign trail, but it happens with party leaders in particular, if they're just making a visit somewhere in normal term time, if you like, the extent to which their spads, their handlers, their press people, it's like, John, they go into a room, you see them sort of going ahead, and they're looking all around the room for precisely that, right? They're looking for exit signs, they're looking for anything that might kind of potentially make a bad photograph or that will later sort of blow up in their faces. It's a fictional example, but in that way that people have seen the thick of it when the Labour leader in it, Nicola Murray, ends up standing in front of a sign in such a way as it says "I am bent," while she's going there to try and dispel elements of a corruption story, and it is that. So normally, SPAD's jobs and the press people in particular, they are, every time they see a room and they go into a room or they're meeting someone or whatever it is, it's kind of their job to think in every which way possible, how could this be converted or contorted in such a way as it ends up blowing up in the face of my principal, my candidate. And it has been somewhat surprising. And look, the campaign trail, it's really, really hard. They're working like 18, 20 hours a day, and the press can be devilish with this stuff. But it has been surprising just how much of that stuff has happened so quickly, though it is easier to do, or it happens more with the age of social media, because everything becomes so memeable.
There are 2 points I'd make about it. The first is that, the pitfalls, and you have an advance team that are there with you on the campaign. Every campaign team, and even the royal family, has an advance team that they go and scout the venue before anyone else gets there. They work out where they want the cameras to set up, where the crush barriers need to be, where you're going to line up the photographers so that they get the best shot with the principal in view. That's part one. But that leads me to part two, which is, were the Tory party ready for Rishi Sunak to launch this campaign?
It's amazing.
That is the astonishing bit about it. I get the impression that, oh Christ, we're fighting a general election now. Bloody hell, no one told me we were going to be doing that. And then they're suddenly scrambling and haven't got these things tied down in a way that you would imagine that they would have done. If you look at the first event that happened, when he's surrounded by the cabinet, there are no placards, there are no posters. It's all seemed to have happened out of the blue, where the Conservative campaign headquarters seems surprised by what they're doing.
The one power that you have if you're Prime Minister, and we now have the system we used to have where you call the election, the one power that you have is you have the element of surprise, as in that you know when the election's going to be and no one else does. And normally that works by taking the other party by surprise. It doesn't normally work that you take your own party by surprise. And yet in area after area, look at candidate selection. We see that CCHQ appears woefully unprepared. There are lots of Conservative MPs deeply, deeply irritated about it, asking that, given that we didn't have the right number of candidates in place already, why didn't we wait? Or why haven't we chosen before? The Labour Party is sort of ticking off or getting through its last few selections at the same time that the Conservative Party has got hundreds still to do. To the point where we've seen this weekend the absurdity, the sort of craziness of the story that Steve Baker, the MP for Wickham, who of course has been a well-known minister in these Conservative administrations over the last few years, has been, instead of hitting the campaign trail and the streets of Wickham, is going to Greece on holiday, which of course is absolutely manna from heaven for Labour spinners who can say, look, this is an absolute sign that this party has given up. Rishi Sunak can't even persuade his own ministers to hit the campaign trail and set her on holiday in Greece.
Yeah, and it's a sort of element of, if you had organised this better, if people had been told in advance, then we could do these things. Rishi Sunak, I think, went on, was it Loose Women, and said everyone can go on holiday, it's all fine.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
No worries, haven't got anything coming up. And people take him at his word and think, oh, God.
The other thing, to move from beyond the optics to the substance, is that the weird thing about this campaign so far, and it has been weird, is this kind of inversion that we've talked about a little bit of the kind of roles between opposition and government. Like normally, if you've got a governing party which is sort of going ahead in the campaign or is, thinks that has got a decent chance of winning the election, as steady as she goes, dispersing policy announcement over the course of the campaign calendar. We're not even a full week in yet, and yet we've already had from the Conservative Party 2 chunky, big policy offers. One on national service, which we talked about on Sunday, and then the other one which has come out overnight into Tuesday about, we've had the triple lock, we're now going to have the quadruple lock. Well, triple lock plus or quadruple lock. What's next? The quintuple lock or the sextuple lock? You probably like the sound of the last one, I'm sure, John. But anyway, it is all. This is the people will know about the triple lock, which is basically that pensions will always increase by average earnings, inflation, or 2.5%, whichever is the greatest. And now the Tories have come along with this idea, and this is where the plus comes or the quadruple comes, which is everyone, of course, has their personal allowance with tax, £12,500. That has been frozen for quite a few years now as a result of decisions Rishi Sunak has made as Chancellor. Fiscal drag. Under their current proposals, as a result of that not being increased, the state pension age, which is gradually increasing, will go over £12,500, and so people will find themselves paying income tax on their pension. This is all Conservative plans. What the Tories have announced overnight is that that will be undone, and that the personal allowance and pension will always be in sync. Now, you can argue that that's good because it's basically a reversion to what we had before. You can argue that it's not much of an announcement for the Tories to basically say, we're not going to do something we were going to do anyway, but it also does feed into that narrative we were talking about on Sunday, which is, once again, we've got a big policy offer which is going to cost, I think, about nearly £2 billion to benefit pensioners, older people, as opposed to younger people who are not going to get any extra tax cuts. They're instead going to end up in the army or in national volunteering.
Well, let's listen now to Mel Strythe, Work and Pension Secretary, when he was on Sky News this morning.
Really big and important announcement today, which, as you know, we have something called the triple lock, which means that pensions have been going up very strongly over many years. In fact, £3,700 more for the state pension than in 2010. We want to go still further, and we will not only uprate by the triple lock across the whole of the next Parliament, but we will also uprate something called the personal allowance, which is the amount you can earn without paying income tax, by the triple lock as well. And that will mean millions of pensioners are getting a tax cut through time. Now, Labour have dismissed that. They say they wouldn't do it, which will drag millions of pensioners into tax who weren't paying tax before.
What happened to some pensioners having to pay income tax on their pensions? Can you guarantee that that won't happen under a Conservative government?
On the basic state pension, that is your form of income, then under our plans we will make sure that you are covered by the personal allowance. In other words, you're in that no tax band. I'm sorry, I do have to make this point, but by 2027, if you don't do that, as Labour propose, you will see millions of pensioners paying tax for the first time, paying income tax, with all the paperwork, the red tape, all that filling in forms that goes with it.
On the Sunday show, you raised the question when you did your interview with James Cleverly, is you really don't like young people. I mean, the reverse question is now, you really love old people, don't you? And that's exactly who you are seeking to get. And I just think it tells us something about the way the Conservative Party is now campaigning for this general election. And I put in all the usual caveats that this is very, very early and it's going to be a long campaign and we're not going to the polls until July the 4th. But it does look like the Conservatives are already playing a core vote strategy. They're already thinking, how can we just shore up what are the basic homes of our voters? And the elderly, pensioners, is where that core vote is, as opposed to Labour, which is kind of going to constituencies which are kind of marginal, which would normally be seen as Tory heartlands, in the hope that they can expand the map.
That's completely right. Look, I mean, Rishi Sunak is in the position of basically trying to smash things up and hoping that the resonance of the sound, enough voters will hear it and transfer over, at least to try and close the gap. Meanwhile, Labour, as we've talked about before, that slightly glib analogy, but with the Ming Vars trying to take it over the tough terrain and actually saying relatively little. We've had no policy proposal so far from the Labour Party. They'll say we'll wait for the manifesto. But I don't really see what Sunak can do. But it is a reminder that
I saw someone describe it as the reverse Ming vase strategy, that you're carrying a Ming vase across the marble floor and you're deliberately dropping it and hoping it goes into 1,000 pieces in the hope that people pay attention to it.
In the hope that someone pays attention. And you've got to think, well, where are we going to be in a couple of weeks' time if that doesn't work? I mean, we should get the first post-election polls over the next couple of days, because the polls that you might still be seeing now on Twitter and elsewhere, those are all the field work for those polls, of course, will have been done before the election was called. But in the next couple of days, we should actually get the first polls which start to incorporate public opinion since the election itself was called. And you can see, by the way, John, in terms of kind of trying to get attention, you can see it in other aspects of what the Conservative campaign is doing as well. Just look at the sort of quotes that CCHQ is giving to journalists. So we saw over the last 24 hours describing Keir Starmer as Sleepy Starmer, or Sleepy Keir, whatever it was, using this sort of Trump-esque language. Today, there was a story that LBC was running, and the source quote that was given was talking about the Lib Dem lie machine. More and more florid language, more and more extreme language. And that is a sign of a campaign that, as we're saying, knows that it is having to fight in a way that an incumbent party doesn't usually have to fight for attention. And that all goes back to the fact that Rishi Sunak has done something amazing and extraordinary, which is he's gone to the country when he didn't need to, when he's 20 points behind in the polls. Prime ministers never do that, and as a result we are getting a slightly unorthodox campaign from a party of government.
But let's just take the attack on Keir Starmer as Sir Sleepy or Sleepy Keir. It's, as you say, borrowed straight from the Trump playbook. When Trump makes the attack on Sleepy Joe or Low Energy Jeb or Lying, Ted, it has resonance because you can see something there.
There's a kernel of truth always.
There's a kernel of truth. Yeah. And that's what makes the bullying effective when Trump does it. It just struck me that, one, do you think that Keir Starmer is too old to be Prime Minister? No. I think he's of the age where, he's younger than Thatcher was when she ran for office in 87, a lot younger than Churchill was when Churchill took over in 1940. And you just think, come on, guys, this is silly. It's puerile, and yet they keep trying to do it in the hope that this will somehow land a blow. And I just think it smacks of desperation rather than serious political strategy.
Well, also, to have a strategy, it should cohere. And it's sort of slightly difficult on the one hand to be telling older voters that you really value them and that you're the party for them, whilst at the same time describing your opponent basically as a knackered old pensioner who should get off the stage. Those two things don't compute and they don't cohere. But much about this Conservative campaign so far that could be applied to.
Do you think there is a roadmap, or is it just smashing things up as you go along in the hope? I mean, look, the triple lock plus thing was obviously sort of planned. There was a kind of tweet put out late last night with 3 locks, big announcement coming at 10:30.
Yeah,
I just wonder whether they have got a roadmap.
Look, I think the roadmap clearly is that look, we're 20 points behind. We know that a reasonably substantial proportion of our vote has gone to reform. We've got to try and at least put the building blocks in place to get some of that back. Before then, we can tell a kind of slightly broader message to the country and then hope to close it further. I think for that to work, basically everything has to go right for you and everything has to go wrong for the Labour Party. And in this, again, we're only a week in, or not even a week in, so, much could still change. But I think it's fair to say that so far, most things have gone wrong for Rishi Sunak, and the campaign has appeared quite feckless, cack-handed, no sureness of touch. And the start of the Labour campaign, albeit they're not saying very much, appears steady, unruffled, and professional and disciplined. And so far, if that theory is right, which I think it is, which basically is you've got to destabilise your opponent, you've got to make sure that it all goes wrong for them whilst you appear completely untrammeled, then so far that theory is just not working whatsoever. And as I say, it'll be very interesting to see how it translates into the first sets of polls we'll get. Internally, the parties will already have some polling, no doubt, and they will have been focus grouping, of course, everything they say to within an inch of its life. So they will have a better idea than we do, but we'll publicly have a better idea of the next few days.
So if you focus on the Labour campaign now for a minute, and cautious, careful, considered, kind of messaging pretty tight so far. No one saying anything they shouldn't have done, although maybe did Keir Starmer want to be quoted as saying he was a socialist? I mean, I don't think that will make much difference either here or there. But actually what happens in Hackney North and Stoke Newington, the constituency of Diane Abbott, does matter, and it is, a litmus test. Maybe that's overstating it, but it is a big decision that the Labour Party have been trying to put off, but they've now got to kind of work out where they stand.
Yeah, so of course this all goes back to the comments that Diane Abbott made over a year ago now. Well, a letter that she wrote to the Observer newspaper where she appeared to, she suggested that there is a hierarchy of racism, basically said that black people experience a more totalising form of racism than Jews, Irish, travellers, others. And this
redheads.
We indeed. So, and many people felt that this was very clumsily worded. It was inappropriate. Abbott was suspended from the PLP. She herself apologised for it very quickly. But since then, she has been in a form of limbo, really, because the Labour Party has said throughout that there's going to be an investigation and they wouldn't comment on it until that had been completed. Indeed, I asked Keir Starmer about this back in mid-March for LBC, and this is what he said.
When we finished PMQs yesterday, when the questioning finished, I saw that Diane Abbott was in the chamber, so instinctively I went over to her to check that she was all right. But we can't just conflate the two. That process needs to complete.
But it's been 11 months, hasn't it? It's been a long... Why has it taken so long, Mr. Keir? Why?
One of the changes I made when I became leader was to take the leader out of that process and make it truly independent, because under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, all sorts of problems happened.
It was one letter. Why has it taken 11 months? Andy MacDonald, he had a case. It's just been resolved. It took 5 months. Rupa Huck had a case. Took 5 months.
Yeah.
This is one letter. It's taken 11 months. What is there left to investigate?
Well, there are aspects to the process which take time. And
it could be a general
they have to
election
be
in
resolved.
5 weeks.
Look,
she doesn't know if she's going to be an MP.
So that was Keir Starmer talking to you in March. Newsnight are reporting that actually the decision was taken and the investigation wound up in December, which would suggest that what Keir Starmer was saying to you was rather disingenuous. And it has been the mantra of successive Labour spokespeople that this hasn't been resolved, it must take its course, etc., etc., etc. If Newsnight's reporting is correct, then this all got wrapped up at Christmas, in which case, what the hell are we waiting for?
Well, indeed. If Newsnight's reporting is right from Victoria, Derbyshire, then either Starmer and the rest of the Shadow Cabinet have been misinformed, ill-informed, in which case it's pretty bad, you should know about what's going on, or they've been lying to us, because there has been if this is right, it's basically been concluded since December, which would make a lot of sense, because as I was saying to Starmer there, it's just a letter. Either you read it and then you decide whether it's beyond the pale and she's just permanently out, or it's not. I mean, I think this is the thing that many on the left have got irritated about, in terms of even what Starmer said there, which is this idea that ultimately this is not a decision for the leadership. Because as ever with the Labour Party or any political party, when things come down to it, when push comes to shove, the leader decides. Yes, there may be some independent process to it, but ultimately it's a question for the chief whip and the leader of the Labour Party whether someone is allowed into the PLP or not.
But what I don't understand from this, and if you look at, you can accuse Keir Starmer of many things, but he's been pretty ruthless in the way he has tried to change the Labour Party. He's been pretty ruthless around Jeremy Corbyn. He has tried to marginalise the hard left as much as he possibly can, and the momentum left that was a hangover from the Corbyn era. We keep hearing that phrase from senior Labour figures: we're going to scrape the barnacles off the boat. We want to kind of get our ship into a good state so that when the election is called, we've dealt with all the crap. Why haven't they dealt with this piece of crap about whether Diane Abbott stands or doesn't stand? If the news is bad and they want her out, announce it months ago, not now that it's going to take up a whole news cycle within the election.
Well, I suppose probably two reasons, right? One is that there is still quite a lot of support within the PLP for Abbott, even from people who are not on the left, particularly from women in the PLP who consider her, rightly, that she has been a trailblazer. She was the first black woman MP.
But you knew that 2 months ago,
yeah, I know.
3 months ago.
Yeah, but then if you announce it then that gives them time to make representations, to get irritated by it. And the other reason, of course, is that if they wait until now, if they just run out the clock, we see that they can do what they're doing with lots of other seats, where lots of MPs, if you've been on Twitter today and over the weekend, you will see that mysteriously quite a few Labour MPs in very safe Labour seats are deciding to throw in the towel at the general election. They didn't make their intentions clear a few months ago. Why? Well, because if they announce it now during a general election campaign, then the central Labour Party, i.e. the leader's office, can basically impose a candidate rather than it going through all of the local rigmarole and local members going through. So basically what happens is that there are a series of meetings between the leader's office, the big players and the Labour Party trade unions and so on, and they basically bash out which of the preferred candidates is going to get which seat where. And that happens a lot for the Labour Party in particular before a general election. It happens with the Tory Party in a different way as well.
And I should say, it goes back,
Always.
under successive leaders of the Labour Party. Election comes, loyal MP stand down, normally in return for a peerage or something like that.
I think it's a pretty good time to be making ermine, I
Yeah,
would say,
exactly.
right now.
Yeah, because they will stand down, they will get a peerage, they'll go to the House of Lords, and the Labour leader will be able to get his favourite old allies, chums, union people who you owe favours to or owe things to, you get them into a nice safe seat.
And Abbott's seat is an absolutely plumb, safe as houses Labour seat in East London, and will be absolutely fought over, or would normally be fought over in openness of a selection contest. I mean, and we should say, of course, I mean, Starmer's office have been exercising an iron grip on selections anyway, highly factional. So this is another step along that process. Like Starmer's people would say that, they want to get the best people they know are going to be good MPs, allies of theirs. It always happens. But this is how the sausage is made in our parliamentary democracy. This is what happens. If you ever sometimes wonder, how do I get the MP that I end up with? This is how. Sometimes, you compare it obviously to the US, where there's an open primary system, or not always open, sometimes it's a closed primary, but at some point the voters, or at least the party members in those places, basically select the candidate, or they vote on who the candidate is going to be. That is not how it works in the British system. It is a far more opaque, less transparent process, where very often, for both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, there is a high degree of rigid central control which rewards political allyship, fellowship, and so on. And you might argue that isn't a very satisfactory way of getting your MPs. It is the way that generally we get it.
I mean, you go back a few years, and there were certain constituencies where it would always be a representative from a certain union who would get that seat.
That's
because
our seat. It's the NUP seat.
This is the GMB seat, or this is the NUP seat, or this is the ASLEF seat. And they would always have one of their members contesting it. And when the vacancy comes up, no, it's not an open meeting of the constituency Labour Party where it's a kind of, who is the best person for the job. It's stitched up.
And when it's not stitched up, this is the story that Blair always tells, isn't it, about how he got his seat in Sedgefield, because it was the last seat to be selected in 1983, because I think the previous MP had just stood down, or for whatever reason it was, and that he went. I don't know.
Les Huckfield.
Right, old drinking buddy of yours.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I've got to check this now.
You check that, but and then he goes up to meet the constituency in 1983, and they tell him to shut up while the football's on, because it was the sort of Scottish Cup final or something like that, and he eventually got the seat. But that is a relatively unusual thing, because it was actually an open seat. But very, very often with the Labour Party in particular, these things, the Labour Party is nothing if not a great set of fixers. They fix things, and parliamentary seats, the most prized commodity within British politics, are fixed most often of all.
I was wrong about Huckfield. Les Huckfield fought Blair for the seat in 1983 and lost. And
what happened to him?
Well, I don't know what happened to him.
Poor old Les.
MEP, I think.
If you're listening, Les. I keep thinking, actually, as we're just sat here, I keep seeing some of my old colleagues on Sky News on the battle bus. It's taken me back on the battle bus. You might have seen, if you've watched any rolling news over the last 24, longer since the election was called, basically, you'll have just seen a series of different correspondents, literally in this really weird, as if they're on a coach tour or something, as if they're on like a tourist coach tour to kind of, to Torquay or whatever.
Yeah, I was on the battle bus all through the 97 election campaign with Major, and we took one flight where I bumped into someone I'd been at school with, and so we sat next to each other on the plane going up, and he then went to the bathroom on the plane, was gone quite a long time, and came back a rather different person, and I think he'd taken heroin on the plane and was fired from his newspaper for doing that. It came out, and he was a famous writer.
Never mind the battle bus, it's the party bus. Wow. And that was going on in Major's
plane. He took heroin on the plane. I
suppose you'd have to try.
The newspaper he was writing for terminated the contract.
I suppose you'd have to try and liven it up somehow. I've never been on a battle bus that bad.
But the transformation, he was kind of rather sleepy and down, not really engaged for much of the journey. And then he came back.
John Major's
back from the loo a different man.
John Major's there going, "Oh, come on, let me have a bit." Need something to get through this. So an important development, as we've been sat here, Telegraph are reporting as an exclusive that Sunak and Starmer have agreed to a first TV debate, head-to-head on ITV next week. They're saying both the Tory and Labour leaders have signed up in principle to the event, with specifics being ironed out before an announcement, and Labour sources are indicating that it would be a head-to-head, a la what Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn did in the 2019 campaign.
Well, that'll be fascinating, obviously, won't it? And that'll be the first sort of electrifying moment of the campaign. This is something where Starmer, although they face each other every week at Prime Minister's questions,
So different.
And and there are challenges for each of them. I mean, Sunak, when he debated Liz Truss in the first head-to-head leadership debate, he was awful. He was talking over her.
Yes,
he was very snappy and and he's got to avoid that. Starmer's got to avoid being boring and not being put on the back foot too much about it all. So I would imagine that both people have got, it's not going to be an obvious who's going to come out on top of this.
And by all accounts, Starmer's been preparing for some months, doing practice sessions for quite a long time, up to now anyway. The pressure will be just in different directions, because there'll be such pressure on Sunak to try and produce a sort of game-changing moment. Now, I'm not convinced that those moments really exist, and that these things can really, I think a bit like PMQs itself, these debates kind of almost translate the political mood rather than sort of yield a change or bring something along that can change the game entirely. Starmer, by contrast, obviously has most to lose in the sense that he's so far ahead. He's got the least to gain from it. But my general view of this stuff is that certainly in the British context, since they started, I suppose the only time when it appeared to produce something significant was the very first one with Clegg and the rise of Clegg mania, which in those sort of weird heady days of 2010. But even then, did it change that much? Because, of course, we know the Lib Dems went backwards. They had that kind of brief moment. So as we become more used to them, I think they become less impactful. But, of course, they will take up a lot of the time of the two leaders, who would have to do a lot of preparation and try and ensure there is not a real clangor of a moment that haunts them in the weeks of the rest of the campaign. Right, welcome back. Just for absolute clarity, just to be clear, we have no records. John certainly has no memory of John Major ever asking for heroin on the plane. Is that right, John?
It is absolutely correct. He did ask for Marmite. So
right.
there were Marmite
was that his
sandwiches.
code word, was it?
No, there was Marmite as it seems.
Okay, fine. Well, that's clear. So, John, if you're listening, happy to clarify. We have got a question that has come in, and of course we're doing question shows, election themed question shows every Thursday, but we thought we've had so many in, and do keep them coming in, by the way, but we've had so many in, we thought we'd throw one in for the end of the show today. This is from James Clark, who says, hello, assuming Labour win the general election, at what time in the small hours of the 5th of July do you think there will be a clear winner? That is from James in Hertford.
So, the process of election night and what Labour will be doing on July the 4th and what the Tories will be doing is trying to ring up every person they know at the BBC or at ITV from about 8:30 in the evening to get some indication of what the exit poll is going to say. And I should say that in 97, I was getting phone calls saying, do you know anything? Have you heard anything? What's going to happen? And Labour was still anxious about what the exit poll might be. Yeah. If you've got an exit poll which shows that Labour have won by a country mile, broadly speaking, you can go to bed, although you might miss out the Portillo moment or whenever it is that someone famous has lost their seat. Otherwise, you get these kind of, is it Sunderland North that is the first?
One of the Sunderland ones, Sunderland Central.
One of the Sunderland seats.
Sunderland Central,
they are kind of, it's kind of moves like a greased laser beam, where all these boxes are suddenly taken into the count and everything happens in 45 minutes.
You know where that comes from? It's like literally some of the local election returning officers, one in Sunderland and one in Newcastle. They've just had a bet on for years about who can be first, and they train these guys like sort of most of the counts. If you ever, most people would have been to a count, but it's usually occupied by like local government workers. Yeah. They're working overnight. They get a few extra quid to count the votes, whatever, and they can take quite a long time.
But you get
it's not the most exciting
4x100 England relay team coming in with the boxes, don't you?
But like that lot are trained within an inch of their life to try and be as kind of like regimented as possible. It is amazing, but it does mean that, I mean, on the one hand, for election night, in terms of broadcasting it, it's not the most useful because obviously the Sunderland and Newcastle seats are not representative
of the country
at all. But you can still see the swing, and it sort of tells you something, and crucially gives you something to talk about for about an hour and a half after the exit
But then,
poll.
so you get exit poll at 10. First results from Sunderland or Newcastle 11:30.
Swindon then,
and then kind of Swindon, but then you have hours of wait.
There is that and then they all bloody come in
when it's up until about 2 or 3 in the morning,
and it's
nothing happens, and then there's an avalanche of results. And so I reckon, I mean, assuming that everyone is going to count on the night, it will be 3 or 4 in the morning. I would think you'll get a pretty clear idea of which way it's heading.
I mean, as John says, basically the great thing about the exit poll, and the reason why the parties are always desperate to get in touch with you, is because it's that one time in the campaign when the broadcasters genuinely have something up on the parties, because the parties do not have nearly anything as comprehensive as the exit poll that's going on for the broadcasters. This is the difference between an exit poll and polls that have been done into the run-up are obviously, in the run-up, they're just polls about voting intention. Exit polls are polls about people, how they actually voted as they leave the polling booths. And what's amazing is how few of these polls can be used to extrapolate the country overall. I mean, basically, the exit poll, which is run by the different broadcasters and with people like John Curtis and Rawlings and Thrasher and these psephologists who operate this stuff. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it is only something like 100, 150 individual polling stations which are used. And from that, which you think, that's not a lot. There are thousands of polling stations across the country, but they can use those particular ones and then compare it to the last time, or the exit poll from the last election, and it allows you to extrapolate out. That's why you can't have, when you have referendums, I remember on 2016, people were like, where's the exit poll? Where's the exit poll? You can't have an exit poll for a referendum because you're not comparing it to anything. The last time we had a referendum on the EU or the EC was in 1975. There was no exit poll then. You couldn't possibly compare it. It would have been no use anyway. But it is, as you said, John, to be honest, if the exit poll comes out, it has been more or less accurate now since every election since 97. Wasn't in 92, but
92 I was a political correspondent that night. I think I was at Liberal Democrat campaign headquarters, and they got the exit poll wrong, and it looked really, really bad because it looked like the broadcasters didn't want to accept that the Tories had won again.
Well, because
they were reluctant, and they just kept on recalculating the exit poll.
Well, it said that Labour, the initial result, wasn't it, that they said Labour would be the largest party, and of course, in the end, the Conservatives had a majority of 21. But ever since 97, it has been more or less on the money. But so if it comes back and says it's going to be a Labour majority of over 100, it might be a bit out, but it's not going to be so out that Labour aren't going to get into government. But as it was when I did an election night in 2017, that when it comes in and it's like hung parliament, or they're just ahead or just not, that is really exciting. And from a broadcasting point of view, is exhilarating, because then every seat counts. Funnily enough, when it's a landslide, I mean, I did 2019, and funnily enough then, I mean, obviously, it's amazing. You get Portillo-type moments, which is really, really interesting. But actually, funnily enough, you probably remember 97. Obviously, it's amazing in terms of it's dramatic. But the story's kind of the same everywhere. It's kind of there's another massive Labour swing.
Oh, my God,
another
Labour
one.
Hove. Oh, my God. All these
the result's
places.
not in doubt. But when it's close, it's like every single contest. We were still doing it the next day at 11 a.m. and we were still waiting in these seats like St Ives that, take ages to count and normally are a complete afterthought. But suddenly you've got 25 seats to go. Tory majority could still happen on paper. Maybe it wouldn't. It's exhilarating.
And the other thing about that is that I think that why it might well be interesting to watch on election night this time round is that I think you're going to see big differential swings. I think Labour will do better in seats where Labour are second and they need to do well to win the seat. Liberal Democrats might do very well in those areas in the southwest where they are second and the main challenger to the Conservative. And so you're not going to be able to say, well, we've seen the swing in this constituency, therefore the rest of the country looks like this.
Yes, that's so true. That is one of the things that's made modern election nights more exciting, is that, when people used to be able to talk about British politics and it was basically a Labour Conservative uniform national swing, like as I've done, sad enough, I watch election nights from like 74, and they'll be going, and now down to Plymouth Moorview, it's another 3% swing to Labour, and up in Darlington there, 3% swing to Labour there, and it goes on and on and on. It's completely uniform. But obviously in the past few decades, as British politics has fragmented in its nations, in its regions, even within its urban, rural areas, demographically, all sorts, it means you get much more of a patchwork of results. It's much more interesting, although harder to kind of make sense of on the night.
I think what we've learned is that Lewis Goodall is a really cheap date. A 1974 rerun election.
Oh, baby.
A cup of Earl Grey tea, and he's away.
Oh, and then some. Keep your questions coming in.
We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.